The Hidden Power by Thomas Troward. Chapter 1. The Inner Side of Truth. To fully comprehend the profound extent to which our contemporary daily existence is composed of symbols is to discover the resolution to that venerable, age-old question. What is truth? And precisely to the degree that we commence recognizing this phenomenon, we begin to draw nearer to truth itself. The apprehension of truth resides in the capacity to decipher symbols, be they natural or conventional, into their authentic equivalents, and the fundamental source of all human error lies in the incapacity to execute this translation, coupled with the steadfast assertion that the symbol conceals nothing beyond its outward form. The paramount obligation incumbent on all who have acquired this wisdom is to earnestly convey to their fellow beings that an inner dimension to all things exists, and that until this interior reality is perceived, the things themselves remain fundamentally unknown. Everything possesses both an internal and an external facet, and the defining characteristic of the superficial mind which precipitates its failure to attain truth is its readiness to remain entirely satisfied with the exterior alone. As long as this condition persists, it is altogether impossible for an individual to grasp the profound significance of his own relationship to the universal, and it is precisely this relationship which constitutes the entirety of what is denoted by the word truth. Provided a person restricts his attention solely on the superficial, it remains impossible for him to achieve any genuine advancement in knowledge. He effectively repudiates that principle of growth which constitutes the very foundation of all life, whether spiritual, intellectual, or material, for he fails to pause and reflect that everything he perceives as the outward aspect of things can originate only from some germinal principle concealed deep within the core of their being. Expansion outward from the center through growth according to an inevitable sequential order. This is the fundamental law of life of which the entire universe is the ultimate manifestation, alike in the grand solidarity of cosmic existence, as in the discrete individualities of its most microscopic organisms. This sublime principle serves as the key to the entire enigma of life, upon whichever plane we may choose to contemplate it. And absent this key, the door leading from the external to the internal aspect of reality can never be unsealed. It is therefore the solemn duty of all those unto whom this door has, at least to some degree, been opened, to endeavor to illuminate others regarding the fact that an internal dimension of things exists, and that life becomes increasingly authentic and abundant in direct proportion as we penetrate to it and make our evaluations of all things according to what becomes visible from this interior vantage point. In the broadest conceivable sense, everything is a symbol of that which constitutes its innermost essence, and all nature stands as a gallery of arcana revealing profound truths to those equipped to decipher them. However, there exists a more precise sense in which our present life is predicated upon symbols in regard to the most consequential subjects that can occupy our thoughts. The symbols through which we endeavor to represent the nature and essence of God, and the manner in which the existence of humanity is interconnected with the divine life. The entire character of an individual's life emanates from what he genuinely believes concerning this subject. Not merely his formal declaration of allegiance to a particular creed, but rather what he recognizes as the genuine stage of development which his mind has actually attained regarding it. Has an individual's intellect merely reached the point at which he deems it impossible to comprehend anything about God, or to practically apply such knowledge if he possessed it? Under such circumstances, his entire internal world remains in a condition of profound confusion, which must necessarily prevail where no spirit of order has yet commenced to act upon the chaos, in which exist, indeed, the fundamental elements of being, but all disordered and mutually neutralizing one another. Has he progressed a step further, and realize that a sovereign and orchestrating power exists, but beyond this remains utterly ignorant of its true nature? Consequently, the unknown represents to him something terrifying, and, amidst a tumult of fears and distresses that strip him of all vitality to advance, he expends his life in the endeavor to propitiate this power as an entity inherently antagonistic to him, instead of recognizing that it constitutes the very epicenter of his own life and being. And so it proceeds through every conceivable degree, from the deepest abysses of ignorance to the most exalted pinnacles of intelligence. A person's life must perpetually serve as the exact reflection of that specific stage which he has achieved in the perception of the divine nature and of his own relationship to it. And as we draw nearer to the complete apprehension of truth, so the life principle within us correspondingly expands, the antiquated bonds and limitations which possessed no basis, in actual reality fall away from us, and we cross into realms of light, liberty, and power, of which we previously held not the slightest conception. It is altogether impossible, therefore, to overestimate the critical importance of being capable of recognizing the symbol merely as a symbol, and being able to penetrate toward the inner substance which it represents. Life itself can be fully apprehended only by the conscious experience of its inherent vitality within ourselves, and it is precisely the endeavor to translate these inner experiences into terminology which shall suggest a corresponding concept to others that gives rise to all forms of symbolism. The more closely those we address have approximated this actual experience, the more transparent the symbol becomes, and the further they remain from such an experience, the more impenetrable the veil appears, and our entire progression consists in the increasingly comprehensive translation of the symbols into ever more lucid declarations of that for which they stand. Nevertheless, the foundational step, without which all subsequent advancements must remain impossible, is to persuade humanity that symbols are merely symbols, and not the absolute truth itself. And the inherent difficulty lies in this, that should the symbolism prove adequate to any degree, it must, in some measure, represent the underlying form of truth, much as the precise modeling of drapery insinuates the contours of the figure concealed beneath it. Individuals possess a distinct consciousness that they are somehow in the presence of truth, and this intuition incites people to resent any withdrawal of those obscuring folds of drapery which have hitherto conveyed this concept to their intellects. There is sufficient indication of the inner truth within the outward form to afford a convenient pretext for the timorous, and those who lack the requisite mental fortitude to think for themselves, to vehemently proclaim that absolute finality has already been achieved, and that any subsequent inquiry into the matter must invariably culminate in the destruction of truth. However, in raising such a vociferous outcry, they inadvertently betray their profound ignorance regarding the essential nature of truth, which dictates that it can never be obliterated. The immutable reality that truth is indeed truth renders such an outcome inherently impossible. And again, they simultaneously exhibit their ignorance concerning the primary principle of life, namely, the law of growth, which throughout the entire universe perpetually thrusts forward into increasingly vivid manifestations of expression, possessing boundless expansion everywhere and absolute finality nowhere. Such uninformed objections need not, therefore, provoke our alarm, and we should earnestly endeavor to demonstrate to those who voice them that the very phenomenon they dread constitutes the sole natural order of the divine life, which reigns over all and permeates through all, and resides inherently in all. But we must execute this task with the utmost gentleness, and not by forcibly thrusting upon them the object of their terror, and thus alienating them from all further contemplation of the subject. We should consciously strive to gradually guide them toward recognizing that there exists a reality deeply interior to what they have hitherto embraced as the ultimate truth, and to realize that the lingering sensation of profound emptiness and dissatisfaction, which from time to time will persistently make itself felt in their hearts, is fundamentally nothing other than the inward spirit pressing forward to proclaim that hidden inner dimension of things which alone can satisfactorily account for everything we observe upon the exterior, and without the intimate knowledge of which we can never truly perceive the authentic nature of our inheritance within the universal life which is the life everlasting. What, then, constitutes this central unifying principle which resides at the very root of all things? It is life. Yet it is not merely life as we superficially recognize it in its particular forms of manifestation. It represents something vastly more interior and profoundly concentrated than that. It is precisely that primordial unity of the spirit which remains absolute unity, quite simply because it has not yet transitioned into the realm of diversity. Although this concept may not be readily apprehended, it constitutes the very foundation of any scientific understanding of spirit, for without it there is no common principle to which we can refer the innumerable forms of manifestation that spirit assumes. It is the conception of life as the aggregate of all its undifferentiated powers, embodying none of these in particular, yet possessing all of them in potentiality. This is undoubtedly a highly abstract notion, but it is fundamentally that of the center from which growth proceeds through expansion in every direction. This is the ultimate residuum that continually defies all our analytical faculties. This is genuinely the unknowable, not in the sense of being inconceivable but of being unanalyzable. It is the object of perception, not of knowledge, if by knowledge we signify that faculty which evaluates the relations between things, because here we have transcended all questions of relations and stand face to face with the Absolute. This innermost essence is Absolute Spirit. It is life as yet undifferentiated into any specific modality. It is the universal life that pervades all existence and resides at the heart of all appearances. To attain the knowledge of this is to apprehend the secret of power, and to enter into the inner sanctum of living spirit. Is it illogical first to designate this as the unknowable, and subsequently to speak of arriving at a knowledge of it? Perhaps so, but an authority no less than St. Paul has established the precedent. For does he not speak of the final culmination of all searchings into the heights and depths and lengths and breadths of the inner side of things as being, to attain the knowledge of that love which surpasses knowledge? If he is thus boldly illogical in his phrasing, though not in substance, may we not similarly speak of knowing the unknowable? We may, for this knowledge constitutes the root of all other knowledge. The presence of this undifferentiated universal life power is the final axiomatic truth to which all our analyses must ultimately conduct us. On whichever plane we conduct our analysis, it must invariably abut upon pure essence, pure energy, pure being, that which knows itself and recognizes itself, but which cannot dissect itself because it is not constructed of parts, but is fundamentally integral. It is pure unity. But an analysis which does not lead to synthesis is merely destructive. It resembles the child wantonly tearing the flower to pieces and discarding the fragments, not the botanist also dissecting the flower, but building up in his mind from those meticulously studied fragments a vast synthesis of nature's constructive power, encompassing the laws of the formation of all floral arrangements. The value of analysis is to lead us to the original starting point of that which we examine, and so to teach us the laws by which its final form emerges from this center. Knowing the law of its construction, we transform our analysis into a synthesis, and we thus acquire a power of edification which must always remain beyond the reach of those who equate the unknowable with non-being. This conception of the unknowable lies at the root of all materialism, and yet no man of science, however materialistic his proclivities, treats the unanalyzable residuum thus when he encounters it in the experiments of his laboratory. On the contrary, he establishes this final unanalyzable fact as the basis of his synthesis. He determines that in the final resort it is energy of some kind, whether as heat or as motion, but he does not abandon his scientific pursuits because he cannot analyze it further. He adopts the precisely opposite course and realizes that the conservation of energy, its indestructibility, and the impossibility of adding to or detracting from the sum total of energy in the universe is the single solid and immutable fact on which alone the edifice of physical science can be constructed. He bases his entire knowledge upon his knowledge of the unknowable. And rightly so, for if he could resolve this energy into yet further factors, then the identical problem of the unknowable would confront him still. All our progress consists in continually pushing the unknowable, in the sense of the unanalyzable residuum, one step further back, but that there should be no ultimate unanalyzable residuum anywhere is an inconceivable idea. In thus recognizing the undifferentiated unity of living spirit as the central fact of any system, whether the system of the entire universe or of a single organism, we are therefore adhering to a strictly scientific methodology. We pursue our analysis until it inexorably leads us to this definitive fact, and then we accept this fact as the foundation of our synthesis. The science of spirit is thus not the slightest degree less scientific than the science of matter, and, moreover, it proceeds from the same initial fact, the fact of a living energy which defies definition or explanation, wherever we encounter it, but it diverges from the science of matter in that it contemplates this energy under an aspect of responsive intelligence which does not fall within the traditional purview of physical science. As such, the science of spirit and the science of matter are not opposed. They are complementary disciplines, and neither is fully comprehensible without some knowledge of the other, and, being fundamentally but two portions of a single whole, they imperceptibly shade into one another across a borderland where no arbitrary demarcation can be drawn between them. Science studied in a genuinely scientific spirit, following out its own deductions unflinchingly to their logical conclusions, will invariably reveal the twofold aspect of existence, the inner and the outer, and it is only a truncated and deficient science that refuses to recognize both. The study of the material world does not equate to materialism, if it be permitted to progress to its legitimate conclusion. Materialism is that constrained perspective of the universe which will not admit the existence of anything beyond the mechanical effects of mechanical causes, and a system which recognizes no higher power than the physical forces of nature must logically culminate in having no ultimate recourse other than to physical force or to fraud as its alternative. I speak, naturally, of the inherent tendency of the system, not of the morality of individuals, who are frequently far in advance of the doctrines they profess. But as we would wish to avoid the propagation of a paradigm of thought whose consequences history illustrates only too starkly, whether in the Italy of the Borgias, or the France of the First Revolution, or the Commune of the Franco-Prussian War, we should dedicate ourselves to the study of that inner and spiritual aspect of reality which is the basis of a system whose logical outcomes are truth and love instead of perfidy and violence. Some of us, undoubtedly, have frequently pondered why the heavenly Jerusalem is described in the book of Revelations as a cube, the length and the breadth and the height of it are equal. This is because the cube serves as the geometric figure of perfect stability, and thus represents truth, which can never be overthrown. Turn it upon whichever side you please, it continues to remain the perfect cube, perpetually standing upright. You cannot upset it. This figure, therefore, symbolizes the manifestation in concrete solidity of that central life-giving energy, which is not itself confined to any single plane but generates all planes, the planes of the above and of the below and of all four sides. But it is at the same time a city, a place of habitation, and this is because that which constitutes the within is the living spirit which makes its dwelling there. As one plane of the cube inherently implies all the other planes and also the within, so any plane of manifestation implies the others and also that internal essence which generates them all. Now, if we are to achieve any progress within the spiritual dimension of science, and every department of science possesses its spiritual corollary, we must invariably keep our minds fixed upon this innermost within which harbors the potential for all outward manifestation, the fourth dimension which generates the cube, and our common forms of speech reveal how intuitively we accomplish this. We frequently speak of the spirit in which an act is executed, of entering into the spirit of a game, of the spirit of the age, and so forth. In all instances, our intuition indicates the spirit as the veritable essence of things. It is only when we begin to debate them from the exterior, rather than from within, that our authentic perception of their nature becomes obscured. The scientific investigation of spirit consists in methodically and intelligently pursuing this very principle, which at present merely flashes upon our consciousness at fitful and vague intervals. Once we realize that this universal and boundless power of spirit lies at the foundation of all things, as well as of ourselves, we shall have acquired the key to the entire paradigm, and, however deeply we may advance our inquiries into spiritual science, we shall encounter nothing but specific manifestations of this single universal principle. The kingdom of heaven is within you. I have emphasized the fact that the innermost core of all things is living spirit, and that the science of spirit is distinguished from the science of matter insofar as it contemplates energy through the lens of a responsive intelligence, an aspect that does not fall within the purview of physical science as such. These are the two paramount points to grasp if we are to maintain a lucid comprehension of spiritual science and avoid being misled by arguments drawn exclusively from the physical domain of science. The vitality of the originating principle at the heart of all things, and its intelligent, responsive nature. Its vitality is evident to our observation, at least from the point at which we recognize it within the vegetable kingdom, yet its intelligence and responsiveness are perhaps not immediately as apparent. Nevertheless, a modest degree of reflection will soon lead us to acknowledge these qualities as well. None can deny the existence of an intelligent order throughout all of nature, for it requires the utmost intellect of our most highly trained minds to trace the steps of this universal intelligence, which perpetually remains in advance of them. The more profoundly we investigate the world we inhabit, the more evident it must become that all our science is merely the translation, into words or numerical symbols, of an order that inherently exists. If the precise articulation of this pre-existing order represents the pinnacle of human intellectual achievement, this surely posits a corresponding intelligence within the power that originates this vast sequence of order and interrelation, thereby constituting a single, harmonious whole. Now, unless we resort to the concept of an artificer manipulating material external to himself, in which case we are compelled to explain the phenomenon of the artificer, the only conception we can form of this power is that it is the living spirit inherent within the core of every atom, endowing it with outward form and definition, and manifesting within it those intrinsic polarities that constitute its characteristic nature. There is no element of chance at work here. Every attraction and repulsion operates with its precise force, aggregating atoms into molecules, molecules into tissues, tissues into organs, and organs into individual entities. At each stage of this progression, we obtain the sum of the intelligent forces operating within the constituent parts, alongside a higher degree of intelligence which we may regard as a collective intelligence superior to the mere aggregate of its components, something that pertains to the individual as an integrated whole, rather than to the parts themselves. These are facts that can be amply substantiated by physical science, and they concomitantly furnish a profound law within spiritual science. Namely, that in any collective body, the intelligence of the whole is superior to the sum of its parts. Spirit lies at the foundation of all things, and thoughtful observation reveals that its operations are guided by an unfailing intelligence. This intelligence adapts means to ends and harmonizes the entire universe of manifested existence in those marvelous ways that physical science elucidates more clearly with each passing day. Furthermore, this intelligence must reside within the generating spirit itself, as there exists no alternative source from which it could emanate. Upon these grounds, therefore, we may unequivocally affirm that spirit is intelligent, and that whatever it accomplishes is executed through the intelligent adaptation of means to ends. But spirit is equally responsive. Here we must revert to the previously stated law, that the mere sum of the intelligence of spirit in its lower degrees of manifestation is not commensurate with the intelligence of the complex whole in its entirety. This is a fundamental law that we cannot impress upon our minds too profoundly. The degree of spiritual intelligence is demarcated by the wholeness of the organism through which it finds expression. Therefore, a more highly organized being possesses a degree of spirit superior to, and consequently capable of exercising dominion over, all lower or less fully integrated degrees of spirit. Given this premise, we can begin to comprehend why the spirit, which constitutes the innermost essence of all things, is both responsive and intelligent. Being intelligent, it inherently knows. And since spirit is ultimately all that exists, that which it knows is itself. Consequently, it is a power that recognizes itself. Accordingly, its lower powers recognize its higher powers, and, governed by the law of attraction, they are compelled to respond to these more elevated degrees of themselves. Under this general principle, therefore, spirit, beneath whatever exterior it may be revealed, is fundamentally intelligent and responsive. However, intelligence and responsiveness imply personality. We may thus advance a step further and argue that all spirit contains the elements of personality, even if, in a particular instance, it has not yet been expressed as the individual personality we observe within ourselves. In essence, spirit is perpetually personal in its nature, even when it has not yet attained the degree of synthesis requisite to render it personal in its manifestation. Within ourselves, this synthesis has progressed sufficiently to achieve that degree. Therefore, we recognize ourselves as the manifestation of personality. The human kingdom represents the realm in which this personality, which constitutes the very essence of spiritual substance upon every plane, is manifested. Alternatively, to frame the entire argument more simply, we might state that our own personality must necessarily have originated from that which is itself personal, adhering to the principle that one cannot extract more from a receptacle than it inherently contains. Within ourselves, therefore, we find a more perfect synthesis of spirit into manifested personality, a state that remains absent in the lower kingdoms of nature. Accordingly, since spirit is necessarily that which knows itself and must, therefore, recognize its own degrees across its various modes, spirit in all degrees beneath that of human personality is inevitably bound to respond to itself in that superior degree which constitutes human individuality. This very dynamic forms the basis of the power of human thought to externalize itself in infinite forms of its own ordering. Yet, if the subordination of the lower degrees of spirit to the higher is among the fundamental laws underpinning the creative power of thought, there exists another equally fundamental law that imposes a salutary restraint against the abuse of that power. It is the law dictating that we can command the powers of the universal for our own ends only in proportion to our prior realization of, and obedience to, their generic character. We may employ water for any purpose that does not require it to flow uphill, just as we may utilize electricity for any application that does not demand it to pass from a lower to a higher potential. Thus it is with that universal power we term the spirit. It possesses an inherent generic character with which we must comply if we intend to employ it for our specific purposes. And this character is encapsulated in a single word: goodness. The spirit is life. Hence, its generic tendency must invariably be oriented toward life, promoting the augmentation of vitality within every individual. Furthermore, since this power is universal, it can harbor no particular interests to serve. Consequently, its action must invariably operate for the equal benefit of all. This constitutes the generic character of spirit. Just as water, electricity, or any other physical force within the universe will not function contrary to its inherent nature, so too will spirit never operate in opposition to its generic character. The ensuing inference is readily apparent. Should we seek to utilize spirit, we must adhere to the law of the spirit, which is goodness. This constitutes its sole limitation. Provided our originating intention is virtuous, we may direct the spiritual power toward any purpose we desire. And how might goodness be defined? One need look no further than the rudimentary comprehension of a child. That which is detrimental is not good, and that which is good is not detrimental. Indeed, we all possess an instinctive cognition of the distinction between the two. If we choose to conform to this principle of obedience to the generic law of the spirit, all that remains is to examine the law of proportion existing between the more and less fully integrated modes of spirit, and subsequently apply our acquired knowledge with resolute determination. The law of spirit, to which our inquiry has presently led us, encompasses the broadest conceivable scope. We have traced its trajectory from the conceptualization of spiritual intelligence, subsisting within primordial atoms, to the aggregation of this intelligence as the conscious identity of the individual. Yet, there exists no rationale as to why this law should cease its operation at this juncture, or indeed at any point short of the absolute entirety. The ultimate measure of any principle's soundness is its capacity to operate as efficaciously upon a grand scale as upon a minute one. Although the nature of its field is dictated by the principle itself, the extent of that field remains entirely limitless. Therefore, if we continue to trace the law under consideration, it guides us toward the conception of a unit of intelligence as vastly superior to that of the individual human as the unity of his individual intelligence surpasses that of any solitary atom within his corporeal form. Thus, we may conceptualize a collective individuality that represents the spiritual character of any aggregate of humanity, be it the inhabitants of a city, a district, a nation, or the entirety of the world. Nor must the progression conclude there. Operating upon this identical principle, there would exist a superior collective individuality encompassing the humanity of the entire solar system. Ultimately, we arrive at the conception of a supreme intelligence that amalgamates within itself the collective individualities of all systems throughout the universe. This is by no means a merely fanciful notion. We observe it as the very law through which our own conscious individuality is constituted, and we encounter an analogous principle functioning universally across the physical plane. Within the realm of physical science, it is recognized as the law of inverse squares, whereby the forces of reciprocal attraction or repulsion, whichever the case may be, are not merely equivalent to the sum of the forces emitted by the two respective bodies. Rather, they are equivalent to the product of these two forces divided by the square of the distance separating them. Consequently, the resultant power ascends continuously in a rapidly escalating ratio as the two reciprocally stimulating bodies converge upon one another. Given that this law is universally pervasive throughout physical nature, the doctrine of continuity provides ample justification to suppose that its analog holds true concerning spiritual nature. We must never lose sight of the ancient maxim which dictates that a truth upon one plane remains a truth upon all. If a principle exists in any capacity, it exists universally. We must not permit ourselves to be deceived by superficial appearances. Rather, we must remember that the perceptible outcomes derived from the operation of any principle consist of two essential factors: the principle itself, functioning as the active factor, and the subject matter upon which it acts, representing the passive factor. While the former is invariable, the latter is inherently variable. Thus, the operation of the identical invariable factor upon disparate variables must necessarily yield a multiplicity of results. This immediately becomes evident when expressed mathematically. For instance, A, B, or C, when multiplied by x, respectively produce the results x, bx, and cx, which differ materially from one another, even though the factor x remains perpetually unchanged. This law regarding the generation of power through attraction applies equally to the spiritual and physical planes, operating with identical mathematical precision upon both. Consequently, human individuality consists not in the mere aggregation of its constituent parts, whether spiritual or corporeal, but rather in the unity of power resulting from the intimate association into which those parts enter with one another. Such unity, in accordance with this law of power generation via attraction, is infinitely superior, in both intelligence and potency, to any less fully integrated mode of spirit. Thus, a natural principle, common to both physical and spiritual law alike, fully accounts for every claim ever posited regarding the creative power of our thought over all matters falling within the sphere of our own particular existence. It is for this reason that each individual serves as the center of his own universe, possessing the capacity, through the focused direction of his own thought, to control all phenomena contained therein. However, as previously stated, there exists no reason why this principle should not be recognized as expanding outward from the individual until it encompasses the entire universe. Each individual, serving as the focal point of his own world, is himself situated within a higher system wherein he represents but one of innumerable comparable atoms. This system, in turn, is nested within an even higher paradigm until we attain the supreme center of all things. Intelligence and power escalate from center to center in a ratio that rises with inconceivable rapidity, in strict accordance with the law currently under our investigation, until they culminate in an illimitable intelligence and power fully commensurate with all being. We have observed that humanity's relationship to the lower modes of spirit is characterized by superiority and command. Yet, what is his relation to these elevated modes? Within any harmoniously constituted system, The relationship of the part to the whole never interferes with the autonomous operation of the part in executing its inherent functions. On the contrary, it is precisely through this relationship that each part is sustained in a position capable of discharging every function for which it is naturally equipped. Thus, the subordination of the individual human to the Supreme Mind, rather than curtailing his liberty, forms the exact condition that renders such liberty, or indeed life itself, possible. The generic movement of the whole inherently carries the part along with it. Provided the part willingly allows itself to be borne forward in this manner, it shall encounter no impediment to its unhindered operation in any direction suited to its unique individuality. This profound truth was illustrated within ancient Hindu theology through the metaphor of the chariot of Jagannath, an exclusively ideal chariot, which subsequent eras tragically degraded into a starkly material symbol. The term Jagannath translates to Lord of the Universe, thereby signifying the universal mind. By the fundamental law of being, this mind must inevitably advance forward, entirely unhindered by any individual attempts to restrain it. Those who ascend its chariot are carried onward into an endlessly advancing evolution, whereas those who endeavor to oppose its progression must inevitably be crushed beneath its wheels, for it is no respecter of persons. Therefore, should we wish to employ the universal law of spirit to govern our own diminutive individual worlds, we must equally acknowledge it in relation to the supreme center around which we collectively revolve. However, this recognition must not emulate the archaic paradigm of assuming this center to be a capricious individuality external to ourselves, a deity that must be propitiated or cajoled into bestowing blessings it lacks the inherent goodness to offer of its own volition. So long as we harbor this infantile notion, we have yet to attain the profound liberty that arises from an intimate knowledge of the certainty of law. The Supreme Mind is equivalent to supreme law, and it may be calculated with the same precision as any specific law governing the physical realm. Consequently, the result of studying, comprehending, and submitting to this supreme law is that we thereby acquire the capacity to wield it. Furthermore, we need no longer harbor the antiquated fear born of ignorance. We may confidently rely upon the principle that the whole can possess no interest detrimental to its constituent parts, and conversely, that the part can harbor no interest adverse to the whole. Although our ignorance regarding our relationship to the whole may create the illusion of separate interests, a more profound understanding must invariably reveal this notion to be erroneous. For this reason, therefore, the very responsiveness of spirit that manifests as obedience to our desires, when directed toward those degrees of spirit subordinated to our own individuality, must invariably present itself as an essential influx of intelligence and power when we contemplate the infinity of spirit, of which our individuality is a singular expression. For, in directing our gaze upward, we are merely seeking the more elevated degrees of our own being. The heightened vitality of the parts necessitates the augmented vitality of the whole, and since spirit can only be conceived as a perpetually expanding principle of life, the demand for such increased vitality must, by the inherent nature of spirit, be satisfied by a commensurate provision of continuously expanding intelligence and power. Thus, by virtue of natural law, demand dictates supply, and this provision may be freely directed toward any endeavor that recommends itself to our attention. No boundary confines the wellspring of this energy other than the limitations imposed by our own thoughts. Similarly, there is no restriction upon the purposes it may serve, except for the singular, grand law of order, which decrees that noble elements turned to corrupt ends inevitably become evil. A thoughtful consideration of the intelligent and responsive nature of spirit demonstrates that no other limitations can exist. The former is a constraint inherent within spirit itself, while the latter is a boundary rooted exclusively in our own ignorance. Admittedly, to sustain healthy action within the sphere of our individual world, we must continually advance in harmony with the momentum of the greater whole to which we belong. This, however, implies no restriction upon our liberty to maximize the potential of our lives in accordance with those universal principles upon which they are founded. There is not one law for the part and another for the whole. Rather, the identical law of being permeates both equally. Consequently, in proportion to our realization of the authentic law governing our own individuality, we shall discover that it is inextricably unified with the law of progress for the human race. The collective individuality of mankind is merely the reproduction of personal individuality on a grander scale. Thus, whatever action genuinely develops the inherent faculties of the individual must necessarily align with the forward progression of the universal mind, which constitutes the evolution of humanity in its entirety. Selfishness represents a myopic perspective of our own nature, one that loses sight of our position in relation to the whole, failing to perceive that our very life force is drawn from this fundamental connection. It embodies an ignorance of our own potential and a resulting constriction of our inherent powers. If, therefore, the evidence of harmonious correlation throughout the physical realm irresistibly points to the deduction of an intelligent spirit residing at the innermost core of all existence, we must correspondingly recognize ourselves as individual manifestations of this very spirit, a spirit that expresses itself across the universe as that force of intelligent responsiveness known as love. Thus, we discover ourselves to be a necessary and integral component of the infinite harmony of all being, apprehending this profound truth not merely as a vague intuition, but as the logical and inescapable consequence of the universal life principle that permeates all of nature. We realize that our intuition was accurate because we have uncovered the law from which it originated. Now, intuition and empirical investigation unite to reveal our unique individual place within the grand architecture of existence. Even the most enlightened among us possess, as yet, little more than the faintest adumbration of what this place truly is. It is the ultimate seat of power, oriented toward those higher modes of spirit that we deem universal. The law of man's innermost nature renders him akin to a lens, drawing into the focal point of his own individuality whatever he desires of light and power from streams of inexhaustible supply. Conversely, toward the lower modes of spirit, which constitute the sphere of each person's specific reality, man thereby emerges as the guiding center of energy and order. Can we conceive of any station harboring greater possibilities than these? The circumference of this vital influence may expand as the individual matures into a broader contemplation of his unity with infinite being. However, it would be impossible to formulate a more comprehensive law of relationship. Emerson rightly observed that a modicum of algebra will often accomplish far more in clarifying our ideas than an abundance of poetic simile. In algebraic terms, it is a self-evident proposition that any disparity between various powers of x vanishes when compared to x multiplied by itself to infinity, because no ratio can exist between a determinate power, however immense, and the infinite. The relationship between the individual and all being must invariably remain constant. Yet, this in no way impedes the law of growth, through which the individual ascends to progressively higher powers of his own individuality. The constancy of the relationship between all determinate powers of x and infinity does not alter the relations among the various powers of x themselves. Rather, the very fact that the infinite multiplication of x into itself is conceptually conceivable serves as absolute proof that there exists no limit to the extent to which x may be raised in its determinate powers. I trust that non-mathematical readers will pardon my deployment of this formulation, intended for the benefit of those in whom it will inspire conviction. A relationship once unequivocally grasped in its mathematical dimensions becomes, from that moment forward, one of the unalterable truths of the universe. It is no longer a matter for debate, but an axiom to be embraced as the foundation upon which to erect the edifice of further knowledge. Nevertheless, laying aside mathematical formulae, we may assert that because the infinite is truly infinite, there can be no boundary to the extent to which the vital principle of growth may draw upon it. Consequently, there is no limit to the expansion of the individual's faculties. Because we are what we are, we possess the capacity to become whatever we will. The Kabbalists speak of the lost word, the word of immense power that mankind has forsaken. To the one who uncovers this word, all things are rendered possible. Is this mirific word truly lost? Yes and no. It remains the open secret of the universe, and the Bible provides the key to its unraveling. It declares, "The word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thy heart." It is the most familiar of all utterances, the word that, within our hearts, we recognize as the center of our conscious being, and which rests upon our lips 100 times a day. It is the word I am. Because I am what I am free to be what I will to be. My individuality is merely one of the modes through which the infinite expresses itself. Therefore, I am intrinsically that very power which I perceive as the innermost core of all existence. For me, having thus realized the profound unity of all spirit, the infinite is no longer the indefinite, for I recognize it as the infinity of myself. It is the very same I am that I am, and this is established not by any act of capricious favor, but by the law of polarity, which constitutes the bedrock of all nature. The law of polarity dictates that everything attains completion by manifesting itself in the direction opposite to its point of origin. This constitutes the fundamental law dictating that there can be no interior without an exterior, nor one extremity of a rod without its opposing counterpart. Life is fundamentally motion, and all motion is the manifestation of energy at an alternative point, and where any work has been accomplished under a form distinct from that in which it originated, but wherever it resurfaces, and in whatever novel configuration, the vivifying energy remains essentially the same. This is nothing less than the scientific doctrine of the conservation of energy, and it is upon this well-recognized principle that our comprehension of ourselves as integral components of the grand universal power is founded. We are prudent to heed the pronouncements of the eminent teachers who have instructed that all power resides within the I Am, and to embrace this doctrine through faith in their sheer authority rather than to reject it entirely. But the superior path is to understand the rationale behind their teachings, and to realize for ourselves this primary, majestic law that all masterminds have grasped throughout the ages. It is profoundly true that the lost word is the one most intimately familiar to us, perennially resting within our hearts and upon our lips. We have forfeited, not the word itself, but the realization of its immense power. And as the infinite depths of meaning that the words I am carry with them unfold before us, we begin to comprehend the stupendous truth that we ourselves embody the very power we seek. It is the polarization of spirit from the universal into the particular, carrying with it all of its inherent faculties, much as the most minuscule flame possesses all the essential qualities of fire. The I am within the individual is fundamentally indistinguishable from the I am within the universal. It is the identical power operating within the more circumscribed sphere of which the individual serves as the center. This is the profound truth that antiquity articulated through the paradigm of the macrocosm and the microcosm, the lesser I am reproducing the precise image of the greater, and of which the Bible speaks when it describes humanity as created in the image of God. Now, the immense practical significance of this principle is that it provides the key to the great law that as a man thinks so he is. We are frequently asked why this should be the case, and the explanation may be articulated as follows. We know from personal experience that we actualize our own vitality in two distinct ways, by our capacity to act and our susceptibility to feel, and when we contemplate spirit in the absolute, we can only conceive of it as these two modes of vitality elevated to infinity. This, therefore, implies infinite susceptibility. There can be no ambiguity regarding the degree of sensitiveness, for spirit is sensitiveness itself, and is thus infinitely plastic to the slightest influence brought to bear upon it, and hence every thought we formulate radiates its vibratory currents into the infinite expanse of spirit, generating therein currents of identical quality yet of vastly greater power. But spirit in the infinite constitutes the creative power of the universe, and the impact of our thought upon it thereby sets in motion a veritable creative force. And if this law holds true for a single thought, it holds equally true for all. And hence we are perpetually generating for ourselves an environmental realm that accurately reflects the complexion of our own thoughts. Persistent thoughts will naturally yield a more profound external effect than fleeting ones uncentered upon any specific objective. Scattered thoughts that recognize no principle of unity will inevitably fail to reproduce any principle of unity. The thought that we are feeble and destitute of authority over our circumstances results in an actual inability to govern those circumstances, and the thought of power engenders power. At every conceivable moment we are interacting with an infinitely sensitive medium that awakens creative energies that give form to the faintest of our thought vibrations. This potency is inherent within us by virtue of our spiritual nature, and we are entirely incapable of divesting ourselves of it. It constitutes a truly tremendous heritage because it is a power which, if not intelligently directed into channels of orderly activity, will expend its unrestrained forces in devastating manifestations of energy. If it is not utilized to construct, it will inevitably destroy. And there is nothing truly exceptional in this. It merely constitutes the reappearance on the plane of the universal and undifferentiated of the selfsame principle that pervades all the forces of nature. Which among these forces is not inherently destructive unless channeled into a definite direction? Accumulated steam, accumulated electricity, accumulated water will ultimately burst forth, spreading devastation in all directions. But, when diverted through appropriate conduits, they transform into sources of constructive power, as inexhaustible as nature herself. And here permit me to pause to direct attention toward this concept of accumulation. The greater the accumulation of energy, the more profound the danger if it is not guided into a proper order, and the greater the power if it be. Fortunately for humankind, the physical forces, such as electricity, do not typically subsist in a highly concentrated state. Occasionally circumstances converge to produce such concentration, but as a general rule the elements of power remain more or less evenly dispersed. Similarly, for the vast mass of humanity, this spiritual power has not yet attained a particularly high degree of concentration. Every mind, it is true, must serve in some measure as a center of concentration, for otherwise it would possess no conscious individuality. But the power of the individualized mind escalates rapidly as it recognizes its unity with the infinite life, and its thought currents, whether sagely or poorly directed, subsequently assume a proportionately greater significance. Hence, the detrimental effects of erroneously directed thought are somewhat mitigated among the broad expanse of mankind, and numerous factors operate to impart a proper direction to their thoughts, even though the thinkers themselves remain in. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.